My name is Shama Venkateshwar. I'm the director of the Public Policy Program here at Roosevelt House, as well as distinguished lecturer at the college. On behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb and Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer, I welcome you all here tonight for our discussion on poverty politics and modern feminism with a group of our distinguished speakers. One of our speakers, Felicia Kornbluh's book, Ensuring Poverty, Welfare Reform in Feminist Perspective, is available upstairs for purchase, and it'll be available for you all during the reception as well. It's only fitting that tonight's timely discussion is taking place here at Roosevelt House, the former home of President Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, to which they moved here in 1908. There were many important guests that the Roosevelts hosted right here in this house, including Rose Schneiderman, a socialist and feminist, a labor union organizer and leader. As a member of the Women's Trade Union League, she drew attention to unsafe working conditions following the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. Another important guest here was Frances Perkins, who was a regular guest in FDR's home. After he was elected president, she visited Roosevelt House in February 1933, right before the inauguration in March. And she wanted to discuss her appointment as Secretary of Labor and the first woman cabinet member. So those early ideas that led to laws to improve working conditions were conceived right here, actually on the second floor, which is now FDR's library. And that included discussions around minimum wage, maximum hours of work, strengthening workers' abilities to create unions, and of course, most importantly, Social Security. So we would like to imagine that tonight, Eleanor and Franklin and their group of progressively minded friends would be very pleased to have this event here that is co-sponsored generously with Hunter College's Women and Gender Studies Department that focuses on poverty, racialized gender inequality, and the economic precarity of single mothers. And we are very, very pleased to be having that conversation today. One of our panelists, Frances Fox Piven, a mentor and role model of mine, who has written extensively on poor people's movements, is unfortunately not here tonight. She has taken ill, but she sends her very best, and I hope we can host her here at another time, and her voice will be very missed. So it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Lewis, professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, who will moderate this evening's discussions. Thank you and welcome again.
Testing. Good? Okay. So what we're going to do tonight is have Felicia start off. And I think the idea is to have you do an overview of the book, more or less, and basically state the basic argument. And then our other two panelists will respond. And after that's done, I may pose some questions. I guess I will based on what I hear from the three of them. And I guess at that point you may want to talk to each other a little bit if you want to, right? You may have questions for each other or comments. And then we'll open things up for the audience. That's sort of the plan for this evening. So let's start with Felicia.
And how is my sound? Am I good? All right, so I'll sit. So first of all, thanks to everyone who made this event possible. My co-author, Gwendolyn Mink, first of all, who sends her regrets, she can't be here. My colleague, Sanford Schram, who made the connection with Roosevelt House. Vicki Lenz and Mimi Abramovitz of the Silberman School of Social Work, who weren't able to join us, but were kind of in on the ground floor of planning this event. Shama, who has been actually great to work with, and the other staff members of Roosevelt House, to my co-panelists, including Frances, who we're so sorry not to have here tonight. She's also been a mentor and a role model of mine for many, many years. And to the Women and Gender Studies department at Hunter College. And last, I want to call a shout out to my friends and colleagues and family in the room, including a couple of members of my writers group who are here tonight. I know many of you are here and all beloved, but I will mention in particular a longtime friend of my family and New York City anti-poverty warrior named Henry Friedman, the retired executive director of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. It's very lovely to have him here in particular. Okay, so about the book. I'm just going to speak briefly about the argument and about the law that it is focused on. And I know there are probably people here with very different degrees of kind of background on this particular legislation. So those of you who are completely briefed, bear with me. And those of you who aren't so into the details of statutes about poverty, bear with us. We'll get to the analytic stuff as well. Okay. In a study published in February 2015, researchers found that the 1996 welfare reform law shortens women's lives. Scholars studying just 2 American states compared the old pre-reform program with the later one and discovered that the policy that was authorized by the landmark statute known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, or as I will call it, PRWORA, shortened recipients' lives by nearly 6 months. It also saved governments approximately $28,000 per recipient over her lifetime. An earlier study had found that in Florida alone, the death rate for participants in the post-1996 welfare program was 16% higher than for people who had received welfare in earlier decades. And this data point was really the origin of writing the book. These data came out from reputable scholars in a peer-reviewed journal just at the moment when I was starting to put the book together in writing, and it was at the same time that the U.S. Congress was holding those repeated hearings about Benghazi and bringing Hillary Clinton back for hour after hour after hour, to say the same thing over and over again. And I was just profoundly struck by the contrast between the depth of engagement and interest in whatever the errors were that were made in Benghazi and the complete lack of interest, both by media and policymakers, of what seemed to be a policy that led to the early death of low-income women. Ensuring Poverty, Welfare Reform, and Feminist Perspective, the book that I co-authored with Gwendolyn Mink, is an effort in part to explain how we as a nation ended up with this policy. In writing the book, Mink and I sought to explore the law's impact and to consider why it has so far been stubbornly resistant to change. Our book chronicles the contested history of welfare reform, including often forgotten alternative arguments that were advanced by feminists and progressives, and proposals for initiatives that we believe would actually have helped mothers achieve economic independence and security for their families. We assess policy debates in an arena that has frequently been treated as one of consensus, examining voices that were engaged as well as those not heard, and arguing that, in fact, there was no consensus. We argue that the origins of the 1996 welfare reform and the failure of politicians to repeal or transform it must be understood in terms of gender. And when we say gender, we mean it in the way our colleagues in the Feminist Academy mean it. That is, gender that encompasses devastating stereotypes about men and masculinity, as well as about women and femininity. Gender, a stubborn archetype of binary roles that doesn't acknowledge more than 2 options and has little to do with the way many of us actually live. And gender as experienced by manifestly heterogeneous real people. At the power-clogged intersections to which Kimberly Williams Crenshaw called our attention 30 years ago when she coined the oft misunderstood term intersectionality, and especially at the intersection known as what my colleague historian Eileen Boris has called racialized gender. In fact, we argue welfare reform represents an ideal case study for scholars of intersectional gender in public policy because conventional left-right political polarities really don't capture what went wrong in the life of this public policy. As wise colleagues such as Louise Waquant at Berkeley, Joel Handler and Zeke Hasenfeld from UCLA, and Sanford Schram and Joe Sauce, among others, have argued, this welfare reform, this PRWORA, was part of what we might call a neoliberal capitulation to the low-wage labor market by the Bill Clinton administration, which endorsed the law after it was written by congressional Republicans. It was of a piece with the so-called New Democrats' advocacy of the North American Free Trade Agreement and their insistence on balanced budgets. But to Gwendolyn Mink and me, the political and economic commitments of New Democrats like Bill Clinton explain just some aspects of this law, such as its inclusion of mandatory labor market participation for people who receive cash welfare, but they don't explain other aspects of the law, such as its persistent emphasis on stereotyped norms of sexual, romantic, and parental behavior. So we come out arguing that we really need a robust theory of what we call intersectional racialized gender to explain the place of these kinds of norms, sexual, gender, romantic norms, in public policy in this area. And I think we need a theory of gender in order to understand why so many politicians have fallen for it, why these stereotypes have seemed plausible to so many politicians, including people like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, as well as conservative Republicans. So what we're trying to do in this work really are three things. First, we want to bring the understanding of what we sometimes call intersectional sexism to the study of public policy in the United States, both inside and outside of universities. Second, we want to encourage our colleagues in the Feminist Academy in particular to engage in the study of public policy more persistently than we have in the past. And then third, we really hope that our work will broaden the way that all American publics talk about the safety net and poverty and welfare justice, and indeed how we talk about the history and future of all public policy in the United States. So, in case it's not obvious, let me just note here that this book, Ensuring Poverty, is not a neutral treatment of policy history, although, in my view, it is an honest one. Gwendolyn Mink and I have studied and done advocacy work in this area for over 25 years. We met in 1993 at a congressional symposium on welfare reform that was organized by Gwendolyn Mink's mother, the late Representative Patsy T. Mink of Hawaii, whose manuscript collection from the Library of Congress was our main primary source for the book. Gwendolyn Mink and I were both members of the Women's Committee of 100, which was a coalition of writers and scholars opposed to the legislative proposals that ultimately became welfare reform in the 1996. We lobbied Congress at the time to stop the proposals, and then at the turn of the 21st century lobbied again in behalf of what we thought would be a superior feminist alternative. So our book is in part a chronicle and an assessment of our own efforts, as well as those of my co-author's mother, Representative Patsy Mink. So I'm just going to do two things before I wrap up. I'm going to walk through some of the main aspects of the law, and then I'll just offer a short conclusion. So welfare reform. Welfare reform was the fulcrum of this wide-ranging law, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which overhauled American safety net programs. Chief among them, although not alone among them, was what used to be called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, a program that had its start in the Social Security Act of 1935, which was produced by Francis Perkins and FDR, among others. So it ended that old program and created instead temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, T-A-N-F. And there are really 4 parts of what happened in that I'll call attention to. The first, just at the level of structure, and the most profound, was that the Republican Congress and the Bill Clinton White House together ended the entitlement to cash welfare for impoverished moms and kids. And what that meant was 2 major things. One was, when we have no entitlement, what that means is that, first of all, the funding for the program became a block grant, right? And so there's a capped amount or a maximum amount of money that the federal government will spend and will distribute to the states. So no longer an entitlement means block grant, maximum amount of money, which means that the states can run out of money, right? And that people who qualify and who are eligible in every way to receive benefits still might not get it. And then the other aspect of that is that for individuals, there's no entitlement. And the federal government instituted a 5-year lifetime limit for the receipt of benefits. And it said explicitly to the states, the Fed said to the states, that they must have a maximum of 5 years. They're not allowed to do more than that with federal funds, although if they want to, they can do less. And several states have made even lower lifetime limits for people. So again, even if you really need it, even if you're really poor and you meet all of your state's eligibility criteria, you have no individual entitlement. And you might not get benefits, even up to those 5 years. Okay, so that's the first big thing. The second thing is that it instituted a program of mandatory work for recipients of this program. And the federal government said to the states, they must require work, and they must sanction non-participation in work, and also said that if they want to, they can impose what are called full family sanctions. So, you know, if I'm a mom and I fail to follow one of the rules, and my benefits are going to be cut, actually my entire family, including all of my kids, will also have their benefits cut. So it's a full family sanction. And most states have adopted that policy. And then also, while imposing this work requirement, this mandatory work, the federal government actually cut people's access to education. Seems like a paradox, right? Under the prior welfare law, there was actually a major welfare reform in 1988, and under that law, people had gained some access to education, and they could count even receiving a 4-year degree from a good college as a form of work that they were doing, right? But under this PRWRA, actually that shrunk dramatically, and people could only do 12 months of vocational education. People also did not receive a guarantee of childcare for their kids under this law. Although Bill Clinton said a lot of nice things about that, about childcare, actually there was no guarantee. So that's the 2 biggies. Then in the area of gender and reproductive rights, there are lots of aspects of this law that are troubling. I'll just mention 2 things. One is that the legislation said expressly that states could impose a so-called family cap, meaning if you have more kids, you don't receive any additional increment of money for those additional kids. So it's a kind of government coercion to try and keep you from having fewer children. In general, kind of a problematic thing for feminists, although a lot of feminists didn't call this one out. It also tightened and made much more draconian the child support guidelines. And this is where the masculinity stuff comes in. There was a lot of rhetoric at the time, and has been since, about so-called deadbeat dads who have to pay more money. And of course, all of that rhetoric has been pointed at low-income men, mostly men of color, some of whom are now caught in what we call a form of carceral debt peonage. In other words, people are literally going to jail under these policies. And then the last thing that I'll say is that this law actually created a new dividing line between immigrants and non-immigrants, or citizens and non-citizens. In the old days, if you were a documented immigrant, if you had all your paperwork, you could receive public benefits. Under this law, for the first time, there was a bright line between citizens and non-citizens in terms of receipt of benefits. And some of this has been reformed in the years since, but you know, I think it's troubling and important for us in the age of Trump, when we're all concerned about Trump's rhetoric about immigrants, to remember that it was a Democratic White House that kind of co-signed this particular version of anti-immigrant politics. So those are the major aspects of the law. You know, as a result, and not surprisingly, this new TANF program and this PRWRA did little to diminish women's and children's poverty. You know, at the time we were drafting the book, the single mother poverty rate in America was 36% overall, 39% for African American female-headed families, 41% for Latina-headed families, 43% for Native American families, and 42% for families headed by foreign-born women. And still, despite the persistence of these numbers, which would seem to be a signal of failure, welfare reform has actually become a model for anti-poverty policy in the United States. The law's main features, including work requirements and surveillance of recipients' behavior, have been exported to other anti-poverty programs such as SNAP or the food stamp program and public housing. And as people may know, the Trump administration, by administrative fiat, has permitted the states to add work requirements to participation in the Medicaid program. Let me just conclude so that we can get into the more dialogue. I hope people are persuaded this isn't a great piece of legislation, and yet it's been very influential. And one question that has kind of haunted the writing of this book and the thinking about it is, why has this law lasted for so long? Why haven't progressives and feminists been able to change it, even as in the case of the lobbying effort that Wendy Mink and I participated in? We lobby and write position papers and organize to the best of our ability. Well, I would say the failure isn't because feminist-minded reformers didn't have the data. I just told you a little bit about the data, right? It wasn't because we lacked a feminist public philosophy that we were broadcasting to the best of our ability. It wasn't even because we failed to turn that philosophy into a set of discrete legislative proposals. We actually did that, thanks to Representative Patsy Mink's help. I think in part it was because we were trying, and we've continued to try, to participate in a public sphere that is really starved of important feminist ideas. Gwendolyn Mink and I focus in the book on the ideas of intersectionality and reproductive justice, both academic as well as activist ideas. And these ideas call attention to the different ways that gender hierarchy is experienced by people with diverse histories, identities, and characteristics in the US. And the idea of reproductive justice in particular, I think, is important because it follows this idea particularly into the realms of childbearing and parenting. And it really asks that feminists expand their pro-choice movement and their approach to reproductive rights to include what it might take to ensure the uncoerced choice to parent, to be a parent, as well as the choice to avoid parenting. Now, many of us in this audience might know what these ideas, intersectionality and reproductive justice, mean. That might be our lingo. But I guarantee you that the number of people in Washington who know what these ideas mean is infinitesimally small. And I don't think even a lot of feminists who are reaching vast audiences today, like Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg, who wrote that book, Lean In, right? Or some of the feminist celebrities who have a gazillion followers on Twitter. I don't think they're really fluent in these ideas either. And one thing I learned from doing political work on welfare reform is that even liberal and women legislators seemed not to understand the challenge that ideas like this pose to their familiar ways of doing business. So, for example, when I was lobbying, I was arguing with a woman legislator from Connecticut, and I was trying to call her attention to why welfare reform was so important for women. and was even a matter of feminist justice. And she suggested in response that being pro-choice and female as a member of Congress was plenty feminist enough. And that she shouldn't be asked to do anything more than that. So I think, unfortunately, that a lot of the people who hold political power, even if they're female and pro-choice, just haven't kept up with what's been going on in terms of feminist activism and knowledge production. So I think this is where we all come in. I think it's our job to blaze and then to walk as many trails between the academy and the arenas where public policy is made as we possibly can. In particular, I would like to say to those of us who are students, scholars, teachers, I think we should up our game in public policy studies, in particular, to bring real feminist attention to that field, especially intersectional feminist attention. I think we can bring urgent concerns to the fields of legal history and legal studies, and then even beyond the academy, I think all of us have a role to play outside the academy as educated people, as people who are engaged in these issues. A lot of the work for us to do, I think, is not at the federal level. It's much more local, at the door of the state house, the county, or the city government, or even at the neighborhood level. And I think we'll hear some of that to some degree about what's going on with the Welfare Rights Initiative at Hunter College as an example of doing that, that kind of work. But we should just always remember that when we're like sitting at home railing at the TV when we watch MSNBC or whatever, that like there's a lot to be done. And if we care about the fortunes of low-income women and children, we should remember that, you know, their lives are shaped by public policy at every conceivable level: state, county, city, neighborhood, welfare office, etc., and that we can make a difference at all those levels. Where I live in northern New England, the population is small and the government is relatively accessible. And I've done a fair amount of state level work, including right now participating in a state coalition to try and raise the grants for families that are receiving this TANF aid, and to make sure that our state actually uses its TANF money for TANF clients. That's another issue we might get into. States don't always use the money. And I also have been serving on the regional board of Planned Parenthood and trying to further a conversation within Planned Parenthood about this concept of reproductive justice beyond reproductive rights. So those are two things that I've been very involved in, but I think all of us can think about where, you know, where our passions for these kinds of issues intersect with real opportunities to make a difference. And I would say beyond the organizations that exist, whether they're advocacy organizations or activist organizations, we might really need to build something new in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish here. Those of us who participated in welfare reform starting in the middle 1990s stumbled into a high level of engagement in public policy making. But we had virtually no staff, no budget, no office space, no apparatus for communications. You know, given our limitations, our impact was, I think, remarkable. But it's not entirely surprising that we were unable to change conventional understandings of how the government, labor markets, and families all fit together, and that we were unable to stop the juggernaut of welfare reform. I think bringing nuanced feminist understandings into public policy might be hard work. But as Representative Patsy Mink used to say, we have to build things that we want to see accomplished. Thank you.
In the program, the order is Dillonna Lewis first, and then Sanford Schram. Is that okay, that order? So Dillonna's going to go first. I don't see many Lewises around, so I wonder if we're long-lost relatives. I don't know. But you're going to go first. Go ahead.
So thank you. Yes, I am actually one of your long-lost relatives. Surprise! First of all, I just want to start off by thanking Shama and Roosevelt House for creating this amazing space for us to have this conversation, which is so pivotal right now, especially given the national climate of, really criminalizing poverty and making separations between the deserving poor women and undeserving poor women, and how that plays out in terms of our realizing what opportunities are available for the women that we are so privileged to work with. As co-executive director of Welfare Rights Initiative, I also teach our leadership program. We have a 2-semester community leadership program, and it's intentionally designed. You heard a lot about the changes, we call it the PRA, because the WO is a lot, the PRA of 1996, and how it systematically pretty much pushed out a lot of our population, which 98% are women, and their children out of education, and education across the spectrum. So this is not even just higher education, it is at the level of basic adult education, GED at the time, and even ESL programs where you can learn, if you are not a native English speaker, that you can learn. And so we saw a systematic pushback in that based on a lot of the welfare policy changes that were just outlined. What I want to do is I want to make the connection between what happens with policy and what happens on the front lines, where the impact is on the communities that we actually serve. So Welfare Rights Initiative, just to put this in historical framework for you, we started in 1995. So we've been doing this work for over 2 decades. We have seen the policies change, but they have changed because of the work that's been going on at the ground level. Students who are receiving public benefits, and receiving public benefits include food stamps, Medicaid, cash assistance, and some minor housing subsidies. And I say minor because it does not at all really translate into what it takes to pay for apartment rates. It has not kept up with that at all. And Welfare Rights Initiative came about very much as an intentional organization. We started at the core understanding that every woman has inherent worth and value. And what does that really mean? What it means is the way that the organization started was basically as a focus group, working with women at Hunter. Hunter has been revolutionary in terms of connecting women and understanding their expert voice about what makes sense for themselves and their families, especially when women are living on a budget that on average is 57% below the poverty line. So we actually asked the women, what would make sense for you? What would be beneficial in terms of moving your family from crises to opportunity? And we listened to the women, and one core of everything was education. It was very critical at that time because around this time we had amazing research from Marilyn Gattell from the Howard Samuel Center at CUNY Graduate Center, and studies were done that showed individuals, specifically women, who were able to achieve their college degree, their 4-year college degree, were able to move from poverty to opportunity at a rate of 90% success rate. And these were longitudinal studies done over a year, comparative analyses were done over years, and consistently show that. And several studies since then have pretty much replicated a lot of the positive results of those initial studies that were done by Marilyn Gattell. Now, in order to have a proactive approach in terms of understanding that we are being led by the voices of women, and I want to specifically center women of color because oftentimes the stereotype is of the welfare queen, and we all know what that looks like. And I must say that we know that the majority of individuals who are receiving public benefits are not women of color, but in the context of an urban area that's close to academic circles, we have an overrepresentative, disproportionately. We have a lot of women of color in our program, and we are really concerned about having the space for them to really tell the narratives of their lives and what it means to succeed and what it means to, in a sustainable way, take care of themselves and their family. Quickly, the Pillars of Welfare Rights Initiative, in addition to the leadership program that I mentioned, that's strategically designed so that for students who are participating in the program, all students are invited and welcome to participate. In the early years, it was mostly women receiving public assistance because that was the mean to understand what is this policy? how do I understand the lingo of the legislation that has pretty much dictated my life and where I can go, how I can go, and how quickly I can move up the economic ladder. And really understanding that when we have policies that are being created in silos where students and women are not at all involved, it does not reflect the positive points of solutions that you have for yourselves and your family. So it's about really debunking that whole scenario and understanding how we can create spaces where women can be a part of the solution for themselves and their families. So it built into the leadership program is an opportunity to learn about what policy, to learn about the skill sets, leadership skill sets, so that they can participate at the table in a meaningful way. Oftentimes, women are talked to instead of discussed with, and oftentimes put out in situations where it's more of a surface participation where I remember back in the day we had the Women in Poverty conferences, and we would have the panel set up where the woman receiving public assistance would go first, and she'll tell her stories, and then they'll bring out the real experts, right? So there was this division that was built in, and this was among women. This was around a large population of women who were concerned about the feminization of poverty, yet in practice, what was done reinforced its stereotype that you can tell your story, and then the real experts will come out and explain what your story is. And so we part of Welfare Rights Initiative is really flipping that whole model on its head and giving the space and creating the space so that women can take it up in a way that benefits themselves and their family. And we receive college credits. In addition, what we were realizing at the time were, while we were working to inspire and educate and really give the concrete skill sets so that women can navigate the process in a way that's meaningful, we also understood that they were being forced out of school. Welfare law had changed, and systematically, actually, even before the changes hit the state, back then it was Mayor Giuliani was our mayor, and he actually jumped ahead of any changes that filtered down from the federal level. So in New York State, Giuliani took it upon himself to start implementing the very strict and punitive work rules under the formerly WEP program, the Work Experience Program. And basically, it was designed as the way it was translated to students back then. Well, it's a social contract. If you're receiving public assistance, you know the law has changed. That means you have to work. No school, no childcare. You have to work. You figure out childcare on your own time, but the primary focus was on quote-unquote work. Work first, that was the policy, work first policy. And we realized that a lot of our students were being forced out of CUNY. Back then, we had 28,000 students throughout CUNY receiving public assistance. Right, even before the initial changes were done, we had just because Mayor Giuliani went ahead and started implemented workfare program in New York City specifically, right off the bat, we lost 8,000. Right? And over time, just to give you a perspective, over time we've lost over 20,000 students, the majority of whom were women, who were trying to make a better life for themselves and their children, were forced out of CUNY simply due to policy change. That just shows you the impact. So we started having conversation with the women in our program, the students in our program, and started thinking about points of solution. What would make sense? Well, at the time, legal aid and legal services was our only resort, right? And we would try to connect for pro bono representation because women in public assistance are not really able to provide legal fees to have themselves and their case represented when they're facing a family sanction, a full family sanction, as was mentioned before. So what we did was we had amazing conversations with Professor Lofredo at the law school, and he's still there. And the dean at the law school, at CUNY Law School, was very supportive. And we created an economic justice project with the law school, Welfare Rights Initiative at Hunter, collaborating with the Economic Justice Project. And the basis of this program is that we have second-year law students at CUNY School of Law who needs practice in representing individuals, like real humans, so that they can understand the whole idea of law in action. And they were paired with our students who were being forced out of school. Well, right away, when a student would go into a fair hearing to contest, say, a full family sanction, and they will get rolled over by the judge and the Human Resource Administration caseworker who is there, once they actually start learning what their rights are, they actually start learning about the administration of welfare law and how to put it into practice. What exactly is a fair hearing? Who's at a fair hearing? What are your rights when you go into a fair hearing? How can you document your experience in a way that speaks to what you're trying to do for yourself and your family so that you can contest what was being put out in terms of a sanction? And we were 99% of our cases we won at fair hearings. That just shows you how insidious the whole process was, and how a lot was about miscommunication and misinformation, intentional misinformation that were being communicated to our students. So we developed a legal advocacy program as a proactive response to what a lot of our students were facing when they were being forced out of school. Then it hit us that we were able to, in the course of a year, we kept over like 1,000 students in school, but at the same time, twice that amount were being pushed out because the policy had changed, and that we did not have a welfare, and we still don't, but that's for a bigger vision. We didn't have a welfare rights initiative at every campus. So unless you knew about a welfare rights initiative, unless you knew a student at Hunter who would then connect you to us, you wouldn't have the resources that we're able to offer to our students. So we realized that we really had to work with policy at that level, policy change, to have a more wide-based impact in terms of being able to help keep more students in school above and beyond the 1,000 or so initially that we were able to keep through our legal advocacy, one-on-one type of advocacy. We started off, we learned a lot of lessons, and I think that's really important when we are communicating. How do you push back, or how do you push forward, as I like to say? One of the lessons that we learned is that individuals, in New York State, our senators at the time, in the Senate was majority Republican until recently. We now have Democrat, but for the longest, as you know, we were pretty much, the majority were Republicans in charge in terms of what specific piece of legislation would come up and who would be the chairs of the committees. They were all Republican. We realized through our work and through our civic leadership and what we were teaching students in the class that at the time, Senator Ray Meyer, this is back in 1999, around 99, was a chair of the Social Services Committee in the Senate. Well, the Social Services Committee was that committee that deals with everything that has to do with the issues of welfare that we're specifically speaking of right now. We connected with Ray Meyer, and he made it very clear that he's a conservative Republican. He has never really met any woman receiving public assistance yet. He was in charge of the Social Services Committee that actually produced legislation to regulate and dictate what happened to women receiving public assistance. Does that sound odd? Well, it sounded really odd to us. So we actually invited him to come down to Hunter College and to meet the women in our program and to understand what was happening. One of the things that surfaced in terms of a point of solution from one of the women in our program, she was actually doing a teaching practicum as part of training to become a teacher. You would have to actually go into the public schools and do your field practicum. Well, at the time, under the work first, nothing else count policies of the Giuliani's administration, that student was doing college campus work in addition to her public school field practicum, and none of that time was being counted. And she was also doing federal work study at Hunter. None of the time that she was spent doing work on campus counted. So from her ideas, like why can't the work that I'm doing right now count? That was the basis for a law that students here at Hunter, and I think this is really important because oftentimes we talk about law and policy change, we imagine that is happening outside of us. We imagine that is happening with individuals who are connected to elected officials or representatives. These were Hunter students, women who understood what their experiences were and wanted to chart something different for themselves and their family. Invited Ray Meyer down. We hosted him here at Hunter College, and we actually took him on a tour of several other CUNY campuses, connecting with campuses that had majority of students receiving public assistance, a high percentage of students receiving public assistance, so that he can meet one-on-one and in person for the first time with the women who his legislation has directly impacted. The bottom line is he left that room and was able to get back to the state in Albany and convince his other colleague to pass the work study and internship law 61-0 at the time. Majority Republican passed in support and followed as well in the assembly. And this, for the first time in 2000, became law in New York State. This was a law that was conceived by women who were experiencing the hardships of being sanctioned, the hardships of having to jump through so many different obstacles just to be able to stay in school. And in 2000, it became law in the Pataki administration. And then for 10 years, we had to work to reauthorize it every 2 years, and in 2010, it became permanent. And this was an effort led by students of Hunter College. So it just it shows you what students are able to do when they believe in their own power and when they're able to actually include the realities of their lived experiences in the legislation so that it's open up to all. So that was a big piece of a champion law that is actually in effect right now, and it's one of the 2 pieces of policy initiatives that were done that is actually helping to keep women in school right now. Just to fast forward, because I know that when I have engaging and want to hear your thoughts, just to fast forward a little bit, one of the things that we have learned over the years, we have 2 pieces of legislation. I mentioned the New York State work study and internship law. And basically what it says is that if you're a student receiving public assistance and enroll at any academic higher education institution in New York State, your federal work study, the work that you're doing on campus, counts as approved work activity towards the federally work participation rate. It also says if you're doing an internship, and we had to convince Senator Ray Meyer that internships for women who are poor is work just as it is for the interns in his office, that it's work. We had to convince him, right? So this just gets to, just to give you a sense of what the realities that the women in our program face. And another point of that is that if the city or any other district wanted to assign you to additional work hours, they couldn't conflict with your class schedule. That's big, right? So that's one, and then the second is that as part of the PRA 1996, right before Bush went out of office, the final TANF rules were issued in 2016. As part of the final TANF rules, there was a clause that said 4-year college and baccalaureate degree would count as approved hours towards a federal work participation rate. But here's the kicker. States had to opt in for it to count. And guess what New York State did? Do you think New York State opted in? No, actually, New York State did not opt in. So from 2016, just to give you a sense, WRI students once again organized and got active and got involved and really organized to make sure that New York State would conform to what was allowable at the federal level. Yes, we still have the 12-month restriction in terms of how long that can count. That's the next level of our organizing. But within that time, students are able to now, for the first time, and it took 2018, the New York State, and Cuomo, it wasn't even a law change. It was just a sentence change in the social services law. That's it. And so now what we have is we have 4-year college, baccalaureate degrees, homework actually count as approved work activity. So this just broadened the option. It's like a win-win solution for New York State because it broadens the option of what's allowable. So students are able to continue their education once they're informed, right? We also understand that policy made and laws made are one thing. We have to then make sure that they're implemented in a way and that there's awareness around them. I'm not going to go on because I know it's a lot to digest, but I think the key point of this is that, yes, there was a lot of policies that are still being made that are based on racist, sexist understandings of who's poor and what their family and their family situation is. There's a lot of, there's still this idea of regulating the lives of women that was lifted up in Felicia's book, and that is still happening right now in terms of what's happening in New York City. One of the opportunities for us is, in addition to having these conversations, is to make sure that when we are speaking about solution, We are looking to the women whose lives are impacted by the outcomes of our policy initiative and our solution proposals to have their genuine, meaningful input. Therein lies the opportunity for real change that actually can be sustained. Thank you.
Okay, Sanford, you're on.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be here tonight. It does seem like it's like a broken record here at Roosevelt House. I've been here 6 years. I think this is our fifth forum about why can't we do something about welfare reform all these years. I remember when the law was first passed in '96, and I gave a talk at I was actually at the University of Hawaii at the time. Pretty exotic location, but there were a lot of people concerned about how welfare reform was going to affect people in the state. And I was working with a broad coalition of lawyers, academics, welfare recipients, and so on. And I gave a talk saying that this law would not stand. And here it is at Roosevelt House. I've been here 6 years, and we're still talking about this law, and it does seem deeply entrenched. And I think a bottom-up kind of advocacy that we'll almost talk about is very important. I think that's what it's really going to take. People in Congress have been very reticent about even allowing welfare recipients to testify. I remember when I testified before Congress in 2001 at the first hearing for reauthorizing welfare reform, the Committee of 100, as represented by Wendy, Felicia's co-author, called me and asked me to testify rather than a recipient, rather than a woman. They wanted a guy who had statistics that might be able to convince all the white males down in Washington to be more receptive. And Patsy was on the committee. It was a great honor to talk. Wendy called me on 9/11. And I was in Finland at the time. And I remember when she called, she said, oh, wait a minute, maybe the hearing will be postponed now. And I didn't know what she was talking about. But then I shortly found out that the planes had gone into the World Trade Center. But they did go ahead with the hearing. I did finally make it back to the United States after being delayed for several days in London, actually. And under tight security, we did have the first hearing on welfare reform, and I presented a lot of the statistics we've been hearing about how we were really, in a highly racist, sexist way, undermining the ability of low-income women to advance in our society. And it largely fell on deaf ears. I mean, Patsy did a great job of trying to get people to listen to what we were trying to say. In some ways, the way I reflect upon it now is that Clinton made a huge mistake when he promised during his first campaign for the presidency to end welfare as we know it. And in fact, that's what's happened. At the time, about 90% of everybody in the country, largely single mothers with children, were eligible for welfare, were receiving it. And that was a big improvement, largely because of people like Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward and National Welfare Rights Organization had championed welfare rights, and women were receiving assistance when they were eligible. It did make a difference, but then with welfare reform, we slid back. We've gone way backwards. I mean, in the 50s, it was only like maybe 25%, 30%, a third maybe of everybody was eligible receiving assistance. Then we got it up to about 90% through the welfare rights efforts of women on welfare advocating for themselves, with the assistance of lawyers in particular, like Henry and so on. Here, it's a great honor to have to reflect upon this. But then welfare reform just undermined all of that. And we're now like about a quarter of everybody that's eligible for welfare is receiving it. But very small percentage of people of single mothers with children living in poverty are receiving assistance. We've basically ended welfare as we know it. And in fact, the Republicans, the conservatives, the Trump administration, they don't stop, right? Now they got rid of welfare, they're trying to get rid of food stamps. They're trying to get rid of food stamps, they're trying to impose work requirements on Medicaid recipients. And the disasters in states like Arkansas, where all these eligible people are being kicked off for technicalities, are happening on a daily basis, and there's lawsuit after lawsuit. And it's like a train has left the station. And I call that train neoliberalism. Basically, what's happened is there's tremendous pressure to integrate our economy into the global world system, to regiment low-income people into low-wage jobs, women in particular, to not allow them to rely on assistance that might be able to help them advance through education and otherwise, to create a globally compliant, low-wage workforce. And it's a human tragedy. I mean, talk about national emergencies rather than talk about the border. For God's sakes, look at what we're doing here all across the country. And I'm sure this is not going to be the last forum we're going to have. The book is great. It's a great honor to be involved with Felicia and Wendy and the Committee of 100 all these years. I'm trying to do what little I can, and I just think maybe in the end, really, we need more witnesses to hunger like they have in Philadelphia, women's groups rising up and insisting to be heard, and maybe we can start to make some progress then.
Okay, I'll ask just one question, and then we'll open things up. So, and it may seem kind of a strange question given how dire things have gotten in the conversation, but in the last few years, and I guess the last few days too, there have been some proposals coming from, I guess, the progressives, I guess you could say, around what should be done about poverty and income support and income inequality, things like that. And I'll just ask you about three of them, right? So one is the Green New Deal that's come up. Some have argued that we should guarantee people a right to a job, like the right to work kind of approach. And then also another idea that's been around in the last few years is the UBI, Universal Basic Income. So UBI, the right to work, and the Green New Deal. Given the problems you've all talked about, do you think any of those as policy directions make sense? And if not, what would make sense? Anyone?
I'll just say quickly, first of all, thank you everyone, and thanks for the question. And I want to acknowledge also my colleague Alice Kessler-Harris from Columbia, who's here and who's also a great expert in this area. The one thing that I find troubling about some of these proposals, and I've been involved in some of the conversations about universal basic income, and speaking as a feminist at a lot of basic income conferences, I think it's great and it's vital. And the Green New Deal legislation, as I understand it, incorporates the right to a job kind of claim as part of the Green New Deal. So I think that's all vital. I would continue to say, though, as a feminist who is focused on the well-being of moms and kids, that we also need to think from that perspective. That we need to have our feminist hats on, and particularly family-oriented feminist hats on, because work alone, I don't think will save us, and neither will income alone. If it's a low level of basic income support that doesn't really allow people to focus on child rearing and other caregiving responsibilities in a substantial way. So if the UBI is going to be like a low-level income support for somebody who has a low-wage job, it may not do the trick. And similarly, if we're promising people the right to a job in a Green New Deal or in any other way, I would still say that we may need to think about, about how that happens. And we may also need to just really accommodate families. And what still seems to be a kind of third rail politically is to say, look, our economy is shedding jobs. We are moving to a situation where people are saying, a third of current jobs are going to be lost and so on. So one solution is a Green New Deal solution, that we should move ahead in alternative technologies and create all kinds of jobs. Great. But what about the idea that people have substantial responsibilities that they can do outside the labor market, and that we should actually, as a society, be okay with that? That's where I'm pushing. That's the place where I think it's still uncomfortable, even for people today who call themselves progressives and social democrats and so on.
Oh, it says on. It was off. So I said. I think there's a discussion that's really important that Felicia just lifted up. This idea of work and who gets to define work, and who gets to say what level of work is accepted or acceptable. And work that's not tied to childcare. I know for myself as a working mom, it's really difficult. I could imagine for a lot of the women in my program who do not have some of the kind of communal supports that are there. So I think when we talk about work that is disconnected from community supports that women need, I would say that we need to focus a lot on issues that oftentimes the community can support, such as mental health issues that are integrated back into the mix, domestic violence and the resources that are needed. So I think a more kind of comprehensive wraparound approach to sustainable income is feasible. And from my understanding, I'm not hearing that discussion with the Green New Deal in terms of how it would actually play out in a practical way.
Yeah, I can't say much about the Green New Deal. I've talked to people who've read the proposal and they're really impressed by it. I myself haven't had a chance to read it. I've been grading papers lately, but I've been working. But the UBI, now, Michael, you and I have talked a lot about this, and I actually think it's a way that people could combine work and care, and it would give them more options. The most recent time I was in Finland last year, they were still doing their experiment with a basic income guarantee, which they terminated because they say it didn't work and so on, and I think that's kind of a setback. You might be able to talk more about that than me, but I do think it actually could be an initiative that would enable us to address neglected issues of care and give people the opportunity to combine care work and paid employment outside the home.
It wasn't exactly terminated, but I don't want to get into that. Based on this note I got, we have about 6 minutes or so for questions or come from the audience. So, is there a mic? Do I do this? There's a mic there. So I'll go back and forth, this side, that side, like that, as far as we can. Go ahead. I think up front on the left.
Even though we all support an ideal system, that's going very far and is probably not immediately achievable. All right, so therefore, what is your view of Trump's programs where he says that unemployment for blacks and Hispanics is markedly down? I mean, to me, I'm not an academician, I'm not a statistician, I'm John Q. Public. To me, that sounds like it's helpful. So I would like to know your view of it. I'm sure it has shortcomings, but to me it sounds like a positive step, not the complete answer, but I'd like to know your view of it.
Well, I guess there are a couple things. One is I don't think Trump per se is responsible for lower unemployment. except insofar as maybe the massive tax cut, which has raised corporate wealth and the wealth of people at the top of the income structure, who may have engaged in some hiring. So I don't think.
Brought back some manufacturing. There have been manufacturing jobs and jobs in other areas that have provided.
I think the numbers of manufacturing jobs are very small that have changed, but I think generally what we're seeing nationally is what we see in my home state of Vermont, which is a low unemployment, and this was true before Trump, low unemployment, but also relatively low wage society. So I think there have been a lot of jobs created in the last several years. It started under Obama and has continued. And the problem is, first of all, a lot of those jobs may not be sustainable in the new sort of high-tech frontier that we're in. Some of them may no longer exist. And then also that those are not really adequately waged jobs. So those would be my two concerns. And then also thinking in terms of mothers in particular, we don't have any there hasn't been any movement in terms of a social policy solution for people, and it's not just mothers, but anyone with substantial caregiving responsibilities, whether for a disabled family member, or an ill family member, or an elderly family member, or for young children. So those are the places where I would look. Of course, people are glad to have the jobs, but I would not attribute it to Trump per se, and I would say we still have a lot of work to do.
Thanks. So I am a social worker by day, and one of the programs that we run in my organization is Head Start, and I've been there for a very long time, so pre the PRA. And one thing that I noticed very early on is when welfare reform was passed, parents, especially mothers, are a huge part of the kind of volunteer infrastructure for Head Start programs, and it's probably true across early childhood and public schools and schools in general. And so one thing that occurred to me as you were speaking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is that the relegation of poor women into the labor force, especially when they are mothers, may perhaps exacerbate poverty both intergenerationally and also at the neighborhood level. If I know from experience that moms were very involved in the Head Start program, and that has research shows that involved parents result in better educational outcomes for their children. So that's where I'm thinking about the intergenerational exacerbation of poverty, and then also communities where there's a very active volunteer community service, the coaches, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but soccer moms and whatnot, that those are probably more vibrant communities because they have that infrastructure. And so if you take that workforce is the wrong word, but if you take that resource away from low-income neighborhoods, then you're also exacerbating. And so I guess I'm wondering if you think that that's part of the story.
That's such a good point. I don't know if people know this, but the Head Start program, or the early childhood education program, it actually grew out of the civil rights movement, out of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the Child Development Group of Mississippi, which was sort of an offshoot of that. And it was supposed to be an activist thing, not just to educate kids, but also for parents. And Head Start has always done adult education right along with children's education, and I had never thought about the way in which welfare reform then deprives that program of its adult volunteers. But I think that's really important, and the other volunteer effort that might be available in lower income communities. So I don't have any special insight into that you don't have, but I just think it's a really important point.
I just want to just highlight that it's such an important point that you raised that, because right now, in terms of parent engagement, and oftentimes when we talk about how we're defining work, that is not seen as work, right? So it was actually recently, we have these ongoing policy work group discussions where the participants in our program join with elected officials, lawyers, and others from different other key allies throughout New York State, having discussions about surfacing solutions. And one of the thoughts that was shared in the last, not the last, maybe a couple policy work group sessions ago, was the idea of including a parent engagement piece as what would count in New York State as approved work, right? So this is actually, so you are so on point with lifting up the experience of women who participate in Head Start program and are there for the meetings and are there for the policy council meetings, et cetera. That's a part of the framework of Head Start. And so for the first time, the Human Resources Administration in New York City under the de Blasio administration is actually saying, we want to hear more for the first time, right? So I think this is a great opportunity if we're talking about how we can kind of think about points of solution for including parent engagement, like for example, encouraging moms to go to PTA and moms who are involved in school and understand what's going on with the educational system, and it's a win-win for themselves and their children, and that could be actually be codified in terms of what is in a policy directive in New York City and New York State. So there's hope for that.
Given the time constraints, I'll take one more this side and then one more this side. Then I'm going to probably get yelled at if I go any further.
Felicia, I'd just like to hear you speak about, you said you were going to talk about the expansion of gender identities in relation to this type of welfare reform policy, and I don't think you had an opportunity to go into that. I think we've been speaking more about traditional gender identity and women of color who are affected by this. So if you can just touch on it.
Well, one of the things that's really strange about this policy coming out in the 1990s, or maybe it's not strange, it probably was sort of in unstated dialogue with what was then, kind of a robust gay rights movement. It was the 25th anniversary of Stonewall in 1994, right? And the movement toward gay marriage was kind of picking up steam. And what you see in a kind of weird funhouse mirror version in this legislation is a recrudescence of the most kind of old-fashioned, stereotypical Ozzie and Harriet kind of picture of what marriage looks like, what mothers and fathers' roles look like, what romance and parenting are supposed to be like. And it was even then, in the middle 90s, like so out of joint with the way people were living, but in a sort of congressional fantasy universe, about the families that they wish to create. Or, I even more cynically think like it was that there was a kind of understanding that people don't really live that way anymore, but that the government, was the power of the government was going to be used to punish people for not living in accordance with those norms anymore, right? So, so we sometimes call this Ozzie and Harriet on the cheap, as enacted or attempted to be enacted through welfare reform. It's not like they gave families resources and said like, oh, now you can have the suburban house and the 2-car garage and be an Ozzie and Harriet family. They just punished people for, failing to meet those norms even when they absolutely couldn't. And to me, it's disturbing in so many ways, but one of them is what's happened to low-income men, particularly in many communities. And I think there are I have to say, a lot of white feminists, a lot of middle-class white feminists, and I'll own it that I'm a middle-class white feminist, who have sort of bought into this, the idea that men should be penalized, for non-payment of child support, low-income men who can't pay, and who wind up getting in like these terrible cycles of debt and even going to jail. So I think it's another really good example of the ways in which these kind of, the bivariate, 2-option gender system, the inflexible old-fashioned roles really, really trap us, And when they get written into policy in that way, it can be so damaging for people.
To underscore what you said, it was also the time of abstinence-only sex education, AKA not sex education, which had a hidden curriculum of gender education too. So it absolutely is all packed together. And I think all of our disciplines can kind of lead us down that track. I've been very struck, Dee, by a couple things that you said. It really resonated with how I've been thinking about my work as a feminist scholar and activist. And the question of audience, and I think maybe that's some of what's been lifted up too, is such a profound one and such a hard one, because our audience is so hard, right? For people who want to develop and see the policies that are necessary to enable people to live full and just, healthy lives, the audience is somewhere else. I don't know where they are. But your story was about taking someone, and it's not a story, you're a reflection of reality, taking someone who was the audience, who was deaf, like beyond deaf, didn't even know they were deaf, and taking them through a process where they became an advocate, right? Through you changed the audience. So first you recognized the problem with the audience, and then did something to intervene with the audience. And I feel like we do not spend enough time at all thinking about our audience. It's very easy to yell at the television, even though it's probably not good for our mental health in the end. It's very easy to talk to each other and nod and, and agree, but when we can't recognize that part of what we must do is figure out how to get to our audience and how to get them to come toward us, feels to me like the very missing in this conversation. The Green Deal, I have not read the document. I've only read, what the New York Times and NPR have said. Those are my, amplifiers. And I keep thinking, who is the audience for this? Where are the folks who need to be moved for any of this to happen being spoken to at all? So it's just an idea to throw out there. I don't think we do a good job with thinking about this. I think it's hard, I think it's painful, I think it's confusing, and I wonder if any of you have more thoughts about that.
I would just like to say quickly, that is such a good point, because that you were able to reflect that back. In addition, we all lift up as well that with welfare and issues around feminization of poverty, there is equal hostility with Republicans and Democrats. And I just want to make that very clear. And independents and, it's across the spectrum. And the work to engage audiences that are not part of our regular environment, it's really long, and it takes time, and oftentimes it takes 10 years to just see one. And I think part of what has to happen in the interim time, I think in terms of building audience, there has to be an opportunity to replenish, right? An opportunity in terms of connecting to and being able to concretely lift up, here is a point of movement for myself as well, so that all that energy is not going out into, okay, I have to go now and educate this person. This person has no idea who I am. Now I have to go, and then I have to break down the internalized stereotype that I too have kind of owned because of what I've heard said about myself, theorized about myself in all of these books about who I am and my character. So I think it's a lot of work, and sometimes we don't realize the emotional impact of fighting at the front lines of poverty, leading with women who are living in poverty.
That's a great point, especially being there for the long haul. I would say, though, that the audience is changing. The resistance is winning. A lot more women of color are now part of the audience in Congress. And maybe it won't be so hard in the future to get them to listen to what we have to say. So there's reasons to be optimistic that we can change the audience.
That was the last question. I want to thank the panelists, thank the audience. Thank Roosevelt House, thank you. And there's a reception upstairs, I believe, right? Yes, okay.